Okay, hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to creating AR using Vuforia. Okay, hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to creating AR using Vuforia. Okay, I'll kill that echo. And so, we're off. Great, that's great to hear, Robert. I'm glad you're looking forward to this. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at Vuforia and we're going to make a simple game with it. I'm going to show you at the start here what we're going to be making today, and then I'll go back to some slides just to give you an overview of what Vuforia is, etc. So let me switch to my computer for a second. You can see Unity there in front of me. I'm going to press play. And what I have here is I have a webcam. You can see my hands. I've got these cards here with some models on them, and you can see that they're tracking nicely within augmented reality. And wrong way around, and with a bit of luck, this one's been a bit finicky for me. I'm going to be able to fire. So what I'll do is I'll bring it close to the camera. Fire, and then we should be able to hit that drone and knock it off. So that's what we're going to be making today. But let's take a step backwards first. First of all, I just want to tell you, so what is Vuforia? So Vuforia is a partner of ours. It's a augmented reality software development kit. And what that means is that it looks at the real world. It's really targeted at mobile phones. As you look through your camera, it can recognize things in the world. It uses computer vision to look at markers or objects, and then it can augment, it can place virtual objects on top of those real objects. Like you just saw there with the cards, I had some real cards and I placed some virtual objects on top of them. So this is used a lot, say, for storybooks, augmenting a storybook, or if you have a product catalogue and you'd like people to be able to have a look at the product in 3D. There's lots of different use cases. So today we're going to learn just the basics of Vuforia. We're going to learn how to set up Vuforia in Unity, and we're going to be using image targets. So there's a bunch of different things that Vuforia can look at. It can look at, I'm going to show you, I'm just going to jump back to this camera view for a second so I can show you what type of things Vuforia can use. So these are the cards. These are cards that Vuforia provides, and you can print these out and use them as well. You can use your own images, and these are called image targets. That's what we're going to be using today. But there's other stuff that you can use as well. You can use a model target. So I haven't set that up, so it's not going to be augmented, but this is the Mars rover, and I can make things appear on that. And my power cord has fallen out. And you can also use other things like this pretty cool stuff here. So this is actually a merge cube. This is made by another company, but you can augment this and make a game out of this. Like one of those is tracking a marble across the edges, which is pretty cool. And view marks. There's a bunch of different things you can use as targets. And as I said today, we're just going to be using these image targets. And so you'll learn how to use image targets, how to create some AR buttons so we can interact and say fire that bullet, and then how we can use our own scripts to detect when when an image target's been received, when we've lost tracking, and we can respond to things like that. So there's a question from Robert Bruce about how the licensing works in Vuforia. You do need a separate license for Vuforia, so I recommend going to their website and having a look at their pricing. So I'm not sure exactly what the pricing model is, but check out their website to see what their pricing is. It says stream will start soon for me. Do I need to refresh? Is that still an issue for people? So some people are saying, there's a bunch of people here saying the stream will start soon. Maybe someone can confirm if someone who had that issue before I start doing a demo with a blank screen, just make sure that people can see. Maybe I needed to click the live now button, I'm not sure. Anyway, please give me some feedback if you're still having issues viewing the stream, and I'll charge on and attempt to fix that if I can. Okay, so now it's demo time. Great, so Liam's saying that it's all working now. I think I forgot to click a live but now button. As I said, we've moved to Connect recently, so this is something I'm still getting used to as well. So now I just want to thank people for the feedback last time. We understood that there's some issues with the aspect ratio of the video, so some people might be seeing a very long, thin video. If you can make your browser full screen, that helps, or making it taller helps. We've let the team be aware of that, so they will be working on making that better in the near future. But I'll get a survey at the end as well, so you can give us some more feedback on how Connect is or isn't working for you. So today I've got that simple project I showed you. It's built from assets in the Vuforia core samples. I will post a link to that in the chat now. So Vuforia have a bunch of samples that you can use and download. This is the core samples. You can download those and play with them. I'll also give you a link to this project as well at the end, so you can play around with that, but it's really just a cut down version of the core samples. So let's get started. I'm going to create a new scene here. I'm not going to save this one. And we're going to start from scratch. So really the aim here is just, for the first section here, is just how do you get Vuforia into your app and how do you configure it. So first thing you need to do is make sure you have Vuforia. So Vuforia is now part of Unity, it's inbuilt, and to determine whether it's actually in your app, if you go to File, Build Settings, and then click on Player Settings, right down the bottom of the Player Settings, we have this XR settings box here. I'm going to open that up here, and one of the options here is Vuforia Augmented Reality Supported, which is ticked for me. It may not be ticked for you. If it's not ticked for you, it will appear as a link, and that will let you just download a bundle and get that installed. So that's the first thing you do, is just make sure that you have the augmented reality installed. It's also, when you go through the Unity installer, it's also an option. It's something that you can check on or off. So when you're installing for the first time, just make sure you've got that installed. Now, how do we set up the scene? So right now in our scene, we have a main camera and a light. Now we're actually going to be using a different type of camera here. We're going to be using the augmented reality camera. So that means I can just delete this main camera here. And when I go to the Create menu here, we'll see that there's a Vuforia drop down here, and there's a whole bunch of things I can create, including a view mark and the model target I was talking about before, and a whole bunch of different things. But what we want to do is create the AR camera. So what is that? So the AR camera is, well, it's got the Unity camera component, so it's still an ordinary camera, but it's also got this Vuforia behavior here and an error handler. So this just is the thing that's going to render the camera background for us. Now, before I press play and get into this, I want to make sure that we're using the correct camera. So you can see this Open Vuforia configuration button here. I'm going to click on that. And this gives us a whole bunch of options for Vuforia for this app. So the license key, the camera mode I'm using, all sorts of different stuff. This is where I load the databases. So today, as I said, I'm using kind of the inbuilt image database that comes with a sample. That's the Vuforia Mars database, but you can add your own as well. You can make that on the Vuforia website. How the video background is going to be rendered. But one thing that's really important to check here is the camera device. What I've got is I've actually got a webcam plugged into my computer. Now, you wouldn't really use a webcam for AR, but it's a really handy thing for testing because I can pick it up and move it. It's not the camera that's on the front of my laptop pointing forward, just makes it easy to work with. So I've got this Logitech webcam I'm just using for testing. Apparently you can actually get something like Droid Cam as well and start using your phone as a webcam to your computer. but I recommend just getting a cheap webcam. This is a very cheap one, so not great image quality, but it does the job. So I just want to make sure that that webcam is selected. And now look at this, when I press play, then I have the camera view as you'd expect. So this AR camera now gets a camera feed. But let's have a look at this scene view. So if I jump back into scene view here and look at the AR camera. So this is interesting here. So this is the camera part here. And then you can see we have the camera frustum, which is what is being rendered. And then in the back plane here, we actually have the image feed coming through. So what we're going to do is we're going to put virtual objects inside this frustum here between the camera and the background. Okay, so let's get started. We can see when I press play there that there was you could see these cards, but there was nothing appearing on them. So what we need to do here is add an image target. So what we have is we have a prefab here in our setting. I'm just going to drag this on. So this is a target template. So this is an image target template. If I look at the components it's got here over the right, the first one here is the image target behavior. I've got to make sure that the image target in the drop down is the one I want. In this case, I'm going to work with the fissure. And this comes from the database I showed you earlier in the settings. When you make your own custom images, you'll get your own custom images show up here. But at the moment, it's always easier to work with something that you know is going to work rather than get this working first and then do your own custom images as well. Then there's less variables to debug if you find things aren't working for you. So got an image target behavior. I'm going to look at the fissure card. Now there's another thing here, a default trackable event handler. So this is one, I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. This lets us know when Vuforia's recognize the card. So we can do things like show a model when it recognizes it and hide it when it's not recognized, when we have tracking. And then we have a mesh renderer and mesh filter, which is a standard Unity components as well. So I have this card. And I'll just zoom in there. So there it is, there's the card. And what I want to do is I want to actually place an image on top of it. I want to put a turret on top of it. So I'm going to grab this turret here. And we can see here it says add content as children here. There's just an indicator of where you should add the children. So, and I completely missed that. Let me drag it onto that and set these all to 0. And set the scale back to 1. Actually, I've completely stuffed that up. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to drag this turret into the correct spot for the first time, and then it's going to have the correct scale and position. So here we are. Here we have the turret on top of the card. It looks good. Let's press play and see this in action. So here we go. Here I've got the fissure card, and now I have tracking. So Vuforia's recognized this image target, and it's placed this image on top. I'm going to look at this in scene view again so we can see this in action. As I move the card around, then the turret moves around as well. And if we jumped into, let me see if I can get this, then somewhere in this space we also have the turret as well, which will be viewed by that camera. So there we go. So we have this tracking. Now you might notice I've got this green drop sheet on here. That's because I've got a glass table underneath and it had lots of glare and reflection. So you do need to be aware of things that might cause Vuforia to get confused. Even this glare on the card can sometimes make it get confused. You can see here it gets a bit flickery when I get lots of glare on the card. This is why it's really important for us what we do later on is do the tracking lost and found handling, so we can do sensible things that if this gets obscured and I lose tracking, then I can give a nice message to the user and help the user get tracking back or deal with that situation. So there we go. So dead simple to get up and running. We've just put an AR camera on the scene. We've dragged in an image target template and put a model as a child underneath it so it stays relative to that. Are there any questions on that so far? Let's check the chat. No, all good. Great. Well, let's move on. So that's part one. What I'd like to do now is I want to add in the drone card as well. So I want to get a drone to appear in this. And then we're going to add some interactivity onto this turret. So let's do exactly what we just did with the turret, but do it with the drone instead. So I'm just going to press stop here. And just to be neat, I'm going to rename target template to be turret image target, just to make it clear what I'm working with. And now exactly the same as before, I'm going to drag in the target template. I'm going to rename this to drone image target. And I go up to the right and make sure that I have the right image target selected. In this case, it's going to be the drone. There we are. I'll just move it to the right a little bit so we don't get confused with the current target. I've stuffed this up, haven't I? So there's this one here, let's check, that's a fissure target. And we have a drone target for whatever reason the preview's changing for both of them, but we'll ignore that. Now, let's grab the probe object from the project. Before I do that, same deal here, add content as children underneath, drag the probe on. There we go, just a quick test to make sure we're working. So press play. Now you can see here the drone isn't appearing, so that's more than likely to be the lack of tracking, right? So now it's appearing. So you can see where I had it on the table there, because there's so much glare on the card, it's having an issue with it. So that's one thing to be aware of, and again, error handling is probably the most important part of an AR app. So let me rearrange these so we're in a good spot. Great. Just going back to chat for a second. So can someone please link the Vuforia manual? I'll come back to that in a second. If Jay's still online, perhaps Jay, you could throw that in there. Otherwise, I'm going to come back to that question later, because that's just a quick Google search for us to get there. So there we are. We have two models. We can see these drones animating. It's just got an ordinary animator on it to make it turn around. Now we want to add some interactivity. So how do we do that? I'm going to show some code in this step. So this turret here, what we want to do here is we want to add a UI to this card. So I have this fire canvas prefab, and I'm going to drag that, place it under that content holder, and you can see now I've got this little thing called fire on the card. One thing you want to do is to make sure that your UI sits a little bit above the card, otherwise you can make it some Z fighting. So I'm just going to make that position Y 0.01. It usually shows that up, but just to make sure that's clear of the card and not interfering with it. And what do we actually have here? So we don't have an interactivity here. What we have is a canvas. So here on the right, we have a world space canvas. Most of the time when you have UI, it is something that appears on the screen and something you can click on. But when we're dealing with AR, it actually is really helpful to have the UI attached to objects, because that means as I move the card around, the UI is going to go with it. So I've got the canvas on there, but how do I now make it interactive? What I'm going to do is I've got this fire button prefab here. Let's drag this side and then I'll go and explain it a little bit. So Robert Bruce Arcs will be showing combining target and flat surface tracking. I won't be doing that today. All I'm doing today is showing this image target and a little bit of coding interactivity. So for people who don't know what that is, once we have a target, Vuforia has the ability to move off the target. It used to be that when you had an image target and you couldn't see it anymore, then Vuforia would have no idea where you were in the world anymore. So what it's got, we have now extended tracking. So you can, once you've got registration on a card, you can move off continue tracking if without having to have their image necessarily in view. Which is a big thing, because a field of view on a phone is not enormous, and so it's useful if you just look off. If you've got a page that has an image on it, you can look off there and have a little bit of a larger play field to put your virtual items on. So what was I up to? I was going to add this fire button. I'm just going to drag this fire button here. And so what we have here is I'll drag it around as another similarly coloured object, and I'm going to put it over the top of this UI. And let's have a look at what it's made out of. So what we have here is we have a virtual button behavior. So this is a Vuforia component that lets something in the world behave like a button. In this case, we've put it over our canvas, so that makes that a button. We also have this custom Vuforia button script. So that's something that is part of this project. This is not necessarily supplied by Vuforia. I'm going to open that up and have a look at that now. So just having a look at the code, this is a really common idiom in the Vuforia API. What we have here is we have a class called custom Vuforia button, and we have this virtual button event handler. So what we want to do is we want to get a function call whenever someone presses on this like it's a button, then we can do whatever we'd like with this. And so what's going to happen is these on button pressed and on button released functions will get called, and it does this invoke thing, which I'll explain as well. But first of all, first thing we need to do is we need to get the Vuforia virtual button behavior component and then register ourselves. So this is the bit that says, hey, please let me know when this button has been pressed. And I'm going to show you some code again that does this to emphasize the point. This is the idiom of how you register to get events within Vuforia. Now, we don't necessarily know what's going to happen when this button gets pressed. We want to be able to do a whole bunch of other things. So if I just flick back to Unity for a second, in this custom Vuforia button, we have this on press, on hold, and on release section. So this is really similar to Unity UI, where we can have events and we can call things. This is actually a really useful idiom to know. So flicking back to the code, we have a public Unity event on press. This is how Unity UI works as well. So what we need to do is when the button is pressed down here, we can call onPress invoke. And what that's going to do is going to fire off that onPress event. Let's wire it up so you can see this in action. It's going to make a little bit more sense. So because I have that Unity event onPress, I get this UI here. So on my turret, I have a Canon system script, and we'll just jump into the code really quickly for that. Really the most important thing here is we have a fire projectile function, and what it does is it creates a projectile prefab and it adds a little bit of force to it. So it basically creates a bullet and fires it. So what we want to do is we want to call this function when the button's pressed. So going back to this custom Vuforia button script here, I can drag the turret on, the onPress handler here. And now when I drop down this section here, I have the Canon system component. That's the code I just showed you. And we can call fire projectile. So that will actually call that function when this event happens. So this is a really nice no code, less code way of wiring things together. You can create some events within Vuforia, hook some events within Vuforia, use Unity events, and then hook them up in the UI so you can create an application that way. Second thing we want to do is we want to change this blue button to a red button. So we're going to go to the fire canvas, has a fire button that has an image on it. So also on the onPress here, if I drag the fire button on, let's have a look at what's available here. Well, I have that image component, and what I have is a reference to the material here. Now, if I open this up here, I have a UI button press material. We can see that UI button press material is red. So if I read this back, when that onPress event happens, it's going to call the fire projectile function, and it's also going to change the image material to this red material. So again, it's a nice, helpful way for us not to have to write code to all of this, just be able to wire it up in the UI. Now when we release that, we want to put the button back to how it was. So I'm going to drag the fire button onto the on release section, open up this, go to, I've dragged the wrong thing on. I want the fire button to be on there. When I open that up, I have the image component here. I'm going to the material. By default, it sets the UI button that's on there already. That's what we're going to change it back to. So easy enough. I'm going to show this in action, then I'll go back to chat and see what's been going on. I think Jay's been handling a lot of it, but we'll have a look anyway. So here we are. We've got the drone moving around. I'm going to do this all back to front because the camera's the other way around. We have the turret there, and we now have this fire button. And okay, it did fire something. We saw we had an issue with that. One, it's losing tracking if I put my finger over it too much, but I put my finger over there, we could see it kind of fired but exploded in on itself. I know what this issue is, so let's have a look at that. So what we have is this turret. This turret, if we drill down inside it, has somewhere. What it does is it has this projectile spawn point here. I'm going to flick back to how we fire projectiles for a moment. So if we have a look at this cannon system, when I say, when it starts up, it finds this spawn point and uses that transform as the place where it's going to launch the turret. And what's actually happening is that spawn point here is actually inside the collider of the actually turret. So what we're doing is things are working, we're spawning this projectile, but it's immediately exploding because it's hitting ourselves. So the quick, easy fix for that is me just to drag this spawn point out a little bit further so it doesn't collide with stuff. There we go, that should do it. So I'm going to save this scene as well, just in case. You never know what's going to happen. I'm just going to call it in progress. So let's try that again. I should have a drone over here once we get some tracking on it. There we go. I've got here the turret, and I've got the fire button. Fire, bam, there we go. So there we go. So we've got two events happening. Let's go back to chat and see what's going on. I think Jay's handled most of it. So there was one about events being async. Has Jay got to that? So are they being fired asynchronously? The answer to that is probably not. I mean, most things in Unity in C# land happen on a single thread unless you explicitly use a job system or some threading. But what you want to do then is use, if you've got something that's going to, if you've got an event from Vuforia, you want to do something over a period of time, then you should use a coroutine or something like that to stop, so things can continue on as usual without. Right, so was the question about Unity events async? No. So yeah, most things aren't async unless you're using a coroutine explicitly. Two events that are going to be triggered. Is that a question? I'm not sure. Oh, the two events. Okay, I think we've covered that. Unity events aren't async, and use a coroutine if you've got something that's going to take a period of time. Okay, let's get back to it. So we've got this basic application up here where we have a turret and we can fire. I've showed you how to do a button with some of the inbuilt Vuforia stuff. Now what we're going to want to do is I want to show you a little bit more about events, because like I said, events are going to be the most important thing you're going to have to deal with, especially for error handling. If any of you make an AR app, I insist, please deal with when you don't have tracking and you expect it to, so you can guide the user to say, hey, is it too bright? Here are some of the things that might be stuffing it up, and here's how you can recover from the situation, because most AR apps neglect that and people get lost very quickly. So What we want to do now is have a bit of audio feedback. This is a completely silent game now. What I want to do is just add some audio feedback when we get tracking and when we lose tracking. We're going to use that to show you how we get those events from Vuforia. So waiting for Unity to respond. There we go, finally. So if you remember way back, I went to the prefabs folder and I dragged in a target template, and the target template had this default trackable event handler. I'm going to jump into that code a little bit and show you what's going on with that. So this is some code provided by PTC, who own Vuforia. And we have the same pattern that I showed you before. What we have here is an interface here called iTrackable Event Handler. I'll just show you what that is very quickly. You can always look at the manual that Jay posted earlier as well to see this. It has one function, which is an iTrackable state changed. So we have an interface here, and we're doing the same thing here in the start button. We're going to get our trackable behavior. The trackable behavior is our image target. Just flicking back to Unity for 1 second to show you that. So we have our event handler and we have this target behavior here. And then we register ourselves, saying, hey, please let us know when tracking changes. So that's the idiom. Now, what you can do here is you can either write your own code, much like the custom Vuforia button. This is quite, a smaller class here where we implement the interface and we register ourselves. Or we can modify this function, this class here that we're going to be using anyway. So that's the track I'm going to take now. I'm actually going to this default trackable event handler. I'm going to modify this to give us the chance to do something when tracking's found and when tracking is lost. Let's have a quick look at this class here. So when tracking changes, we're going to come in here, we're going to say, hey, if we've just detected new tracking or extended tracking, then we're going to call on tracking found. If we were tracked and now that tracking's not found anymore, then we're going to say tracking lost. And we're going to call tracking lost on the case when the application starts as well and we have no known tracking state. So what does on tracking found do for us? Well, what it does is it gets all the renderers, all the colliders, all the canvases that are children of this image target, and it switches them all on. So what does that mean? We saw before when I played the game, the card had nothing on it to start with. As soon as tracking was found, then suddenly I had the model on top. That's this code here. It's enabling all the rendering components. Similarly, when tracking's lost, we're going to turn them all off again. So this is probably code you want to use. I'm going to add to this. So I'm going to use the Unity events as we did before. I could call something directly in here. I could just add to this and say, hey, do this thing or do that thing. But as I talked about before, sometimes a Unity event helps you decouple and gives a bit more control to a non-programmer to start to wire things up in your application. So I'm going to go up to the top and I'm just going to add a public Unity event. It can't find it at the moment. I have to say using Unity engine events. Unity event, and I'm going to call this on tracking found. And then I'm going to do another one saying on tracking lost. So just putting these in here is enough for us to get that interface inside Unity. So now I'm going to move down to those functions. So on tracking found, I'm just going to add something at the end here. I'm going to say if on tracking found does not equal null, then I'm going to say on tracking found invoke, and that fires off any events any things I've got wired up in the interface. I'll do a copy and paste. And I want to do the opposite here. So I want to say if on tracking lost invoke. So just flicking back to Unity for a second. It's recompiling. And now we see we have that here. So we have in our trackable event handler, I have the ability here to add, much like I did for the button, to change materials, to call functions, to do a whole bunch of stuff. So again, nice easy way to get something up and running without hard coding it. But what do we want to do? We haven't actually got anything hooked up to this. I'm going to write some more code here to make that happen. What we're going to do is we want to just turn some audio on and off. So let's create a new script here, and I'll call this, just call this tracking audio. And let's open this up. Right, so I'm just going to quickly, this is not really related to Vuforia, so I'm just going to write this code fairly quickly and not go through all the details. I'm going to give this a public audio clip, tracking found, tracking lost. Now we need an audio source to play this. So I'm going to call this audio source, I'll just call it source. Now what I expect is for this component for there to be an audio source component as next to it in the same game object. So I'm going to use the require component attribute here to make sure that that actually happens. So this is a really handy thing. I could write code in start or await to make sure that it has this component and print out error messages, but this require component really just does that for us. It will make sure there's an audio source there for us. So now when we're in awake, I can say source equals get component audio source. And I kind of have a fair confidence that line will work without source being null. Now I'm going to create two functions here to actually play the sounds. So let's call this play tracking found. And what I do is I say source.clip equals the tracking found clip. And then I say source.play. And that will play one of these clips. Copy paste on tracking lost. Tracking lost. Okay, so I'm going to have two audio clips here, and I'm just going to have two functions here that can play the found and the lost clip. Let's wire this all together. So from now on, because we have Unity events, we can just do everything else in the editor. So I'm going to create a new game object here, and I'm going to call this tracking audio. I'm going to drag on that tracking audio component I just had, and we can see here that it has space for two audio clips, those two public members. And we're just going to use this mouth pop sound when something appears, and a mouth pop reversed when something disappears. So now we have the ability to play the audio, but now we actually have to make that happen. So let's just do this for the droid here. In the trackable event handler, I've added the new Unity events here for when tracking found and tracking lost. I'll drag in this tracking audio clip, and I can say tracking audio, play tracking found, and when we lose that, then I can call tracking lost. Let me wire up the other one as well, I'll do the turret. So drag in the tracking audio object, it knows that there's a tracking audio component on there, and it lets me call play tracking found. And let's make sure I do the opposite as well. All right, moment of truth. Okay, can everyone hear that pop? There we go. So now we have some audio feedback, which is kind of nice because it kind of makes, when an error does happen, if I lose tracking, I get some at least some audio feedback that something's happened. And it kind of makes it a little bit more fun, a bit more juicy, and it's kind of will be the first step of me just making sure that I can lead the user through tracking errors. There we go. I'll go back to chat now and see if we have any questions. What is the reference line that I plug in? The register website is so messed up. So Robert Bruce, I'm looking at your question here. What is the reference line that is a plugin for Microsoft? I'm not quite sure what that question is. Maybe you could rephrase that a little bit. Liam, I'm going to put a survey up at the end. I'd really love your feedback on why, what you hate about our register website. Genuinely, we're new at this and we'd like to figure out how we can make it better. So please give us some feedback. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Jay says, what register website? Is it Vuforia's or ours? I assumed it was registering for this webinar, but maybe not. Go to the code. I will do that. Probably missed at some stage, 2 cards in the editor are the same, but when they're in play mode, there are 2 different cards. Okay, that's a good question. I'll step back through some of this stuff. Above the functions of code, there is a grey line. Yep. These references. Okay. Yeah. So this is just an ad. It's a mode you can have in Visual Studio that tells you helpful things about this. Like if I go to another one, it'll even show me some Git information, I believe. But basically, the 0 references mean that there is nothing called in it. So we are calling this via the editor, but that's all been done dynamically. But if I wrote, if I went to tracking audio and I did something like play tracking found, then we can see now it says 1 reference because there's 1 call to it. And I could click on it. Not in community, only pro and enterprise. Okay, that's good to know. So the 2 cards being the same, how do we do that? So I'm going to flick back to the editor. This is a good question. So we have 2 cards here. I'll fold everything up so we can see them. Something just died because I recompiled. So I'll turn off. So we have 2 cards, an image, a turret image target and a drone image target. The only difference between these 2 is in this image target behavior, I've chosen a different image target. That's all. So when we're in play mode, it detects the drone because in this case we'll detect the fissure because I had the fissure, and then it's going to show the correct model for that card and vice versa for the drone. And keep the questions coming. I'm just going to go through the wiring up again, just in case people are a little bit confused by that, and then I'll come back and answer some more questions. So what we did is we have this default trackable event handler. It registers itself with this target here to say, hey, please let me know when tracking is lost or when tracking is found. And it does that by saying get component and saying register trackable event handler. For us to register ourselves, we have to have certain functions implemented. We have to have, it has to be an iTrackable event handler. and we must have on trackable state changed. So I could have written a much simpler class to just get those things, but this code's kind of useful that it does this on tracking found, on tracking lost, so I just modify this existing class, which you can modify as well. And all I do is when tracking is found, I fire off a Unity event. When tracking is lost, I fire off a Unity event. That means in the editor, I get this really nice interface here, which lets me just wire as many things as I want. So as long as you've got functions you want to call and materials you need to change, that Unity event will let you do a whole bunch of different stuff. Like you could use this to enable UI, fire off an animation, do a whole bunch of different things. So let's go back to questions. So can you make the slider on the side of the turret the slider? Which bit's the slider? I have a button. I have a spawn point. Is it the spawn point perhaps? One thing I'm going to do, actually, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to officially wrap up the stream. I'm going to stay on though to answer questions. But one thing for people who because I've been going for almost an hour now, is I'm going to give you some links. If you want to download the project I've been playing with, you can go to this link here. As I said before, this is really just a cut down version of the core assets that Vuforia release on the asset store. So you can go download those as well. So that's the link there. I will also put that in the chat because I want to move on. And then it's also clickable and you don't have to do the typos. So there it is in chat. There is a Vuforia partner website that you can go to and you can find out different types of targets and other use cases that you can go to. So go to unity3d.com partners/Vuforia. And here's what the core samples look like in Vuforia. That's on the asset store, so go grab those. And lastly, we would really appreciate it if you could fill out this survey here. I also put so you can just grab that survey there, bit.ly Vuforia survey. I will also get a link for that later on as well. But I am going to hang around for more questions, so you don't have to go away now, but I just wanted to get you the resources and links up before everyone disappeared. But this kind of concludes the more, the proper webinar, but I'll hang around. So keep typing. Thanks, Ricardo. Glad you enjoyed it. I'm just getting the bit.ly link. That's the survey. That is not the survey link. I completely did not copy that correctly. That's the survey link. Please let us know how this worked or didn't work for you, so we can make it better in the future. We plan to run more of these. We'll probably start running our own custom content as well. We also run these in India and Singapore as well. So what we'll do in the future is let you know the different time zones. So if you prefer something in the morning or in the evening, you can grab a webinar that suits you as well. So answering a couple of questions. So there's questions about AR Kit and AR Core, and that's great. I should have talked about this earlier on. So one of the new features that is in the latest version of Vuforia is called ground tracking, and what that does is that will use AR Core and AR Kit when it's available. Otherwise, it's going to use its own algorithms. So one of the things that Vuforia does is it covers 95% of the phones and will use the best AR API that's available on those platforms, and otherwise it's going to fall back to other algorithms when those things aren't supported. So that's kind of one of its key selling points. Also, throw in some things you'd like to see in future webinars as well. Is there any content you'd particularly like? Anything you really want to learn about? Is there a max number of cards which can be drawn on at any one time? I don't know if there's a hard limit. There is, there is a cost to running Vuforia in terms of the image processing it needs to do. But I don't know off the top of my head the answer to that question about what's a max limit. So Robert Bruce is asking, can it still do the ground tracking or the flat surface tracking if it's not AR Core or AR Kit? It will then fall back to the Vuforia ones, which is extended tracking. So as far as I know, it would. Yeah, I'm not sure entirely of what will work and what won't work in those circumstances. So there's a question from John, how easy is it to generate your own card designs? It's pretty easy. So there are some guidelines of what makes a good card, and it pretty much is lots of texture that's not repeating. So you would have seen the cards I'd shown, they were nice illustrated art, which works really well, lots of differences in value and without repetition. So something like a photo often works. People often use a picture of gravel or something like that because it has lots of pattern in it, but it doesn't necessarily repeat. And then once you have a design you'd like, you upload it to the Vuforia website, and then they will give you a database that you can then plug in instead. I should also mention there's something called a view mark as well. So it's a different thing to an image target. It's a bit like a QR code. When Vuforia recognises it, it can pull some information out of the card, so you can have a little bit more of a generic thing. So this might be if you were, say, doing a university walkthrough, for instance. You could print out a bunch of cards and then get information about the building you're in front of without having to create a separate image target for each building. I haven't used the smart terrain yet before, Robert. So no, so John is asking, is the detection purely pixel-based? So they have a visual inertial system, which means that it uses the camera image, but it also uses some of the sensors as well. So like the inertial sensors, for instance. So if you detect a feature on a card and your camera moves, you can use the movement of the camera to try and have to try and lessen the search to find that feature back. For instance, if you detect a rotation, you can say, you have a guess about where that feature might be located, and that helps with efficiency. So thanks, John. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Robert, keen to hear your idea. So Joanne, can you use the real sense? I'm not particularly sure about that particular model. I mean, they do support HoloLens, ODG, and a couple of other headsets as well. So if you go to that partner website, it has a list of everything that it supports as well. Yes, it'd be great to do a follow-up session, Robert, on more advanced Vuforia use cases, like some of their extended tracking, smart terrain, the chalk system as well, and model targets and how to create your own and that kind of stuff as well. I agree, that'd be a great follow-up session. Okay, well, I might wind it up there. Feel free to contact me. You can see my connect details there, or send me a Twitter at John Sietsma. Happy to take any more follow-up questions there. But thanks for coming along and joining us today.